The Ghost in Cell Block D. Darnell, Ghost Carter sat on the hard steel bench of his prison cell, staring at the cracked ceiling above. He had been in this hellhole for less than a week, but it already felt like a lifetime. The charges against him, armed robbery and attempted murder, were lies, fabricated evidence to silence a man who had spent his life protecting his country. But no one knew the truth, and Darnell wasn't about to tell them. The guards saw a quiet, muscular black man, mid-40s, with a haunted look in his eyes. The other inmates saw fresh meat, a lone wolf with no affiliations. What they didn't see, what no one saw, was that Darnell Carter wasn't just any man. He was the Ghost, a legendary Delta Force commander who had led more classified missions than most generals had authorized. He was the kind of soldier that boogeymen feared, the shadow that warlords whispered about in terror. But in prison, none of that mattered. A target is marked Cell Block D was run by a white supremacist gang called the Iron Skulls, led by a psychotic lifer named Braddock. The moment Darnell walked through the gates, Braddock marked him. He hated two things in life: authority and black men. Seeing someone like Darnell, a proud, silent warrior who refused to cower, made his blood boil. One night, as Darnell returned to his cell after a meal, the attack came. 3 men, one with a shiv fashioned from a toothbrush, another with a weighted sock, and the last, a wiry man with dead eyes, came barehanded, planning to choke the life out of him. Darnell didn't react at first. He let them get close, let them think he was slow, let them think he was weak. Then he moved. The first man lunged with the shiv, aiming for Darnell's ribs. With lightning reflexes, Darnell sidestepped, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and twisted. A sickening crack echoed through the cell block as the man's arm bent in an unnatural direction. He screamed, but Darnell was already moving. The second man swung the weighted sock, aiming for Darnell's temple. A normal man would have been knocked out cold, but Darnell wasn't normal. He ducked, stepped inside the attacker's reach, and drove a brutal elbow into his throat. The man staggered back, gasping for air like a fish out of water. The third man hesitated. He had seen good fighters before, but this was something else. Darnell stared at him with eyes colder than death. "Walk away," he said, his voice calm but filled with the promise of violence. The man ran. The warden watches the fight didn't go unnoticed. Hidden cameras caught everything, and by the time Darnell returned to his cell, the warden was reviewing the footage. Warden Harris was a former Marine, and as he watched Darnell dismantle the gang like a trained assassin, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen men like this before. Tier 1 operators, the kind of warriors who didn't exist on paper. This man wasn't just a soldier. He was a predator among prey, and someone had put him in here on purpose. A past that won't stay buried. The next morning, Darnell found himself summoned to the warden's office. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. "You don't belong here," Harris said finally. Darnell didn't reply. "I did some digging," the warden continued. "Your case file doesn't add up. The evidence was too neat. And the way you fight? That's not street brawler skill, that's military. Special forces, maybe even black ops." Darnell still said nothing. Harris sighed. "Look, Carter, I know who you are. Delta Force, right?" That made Darnell's eyes narrow slightly. "Why are you here?" Harris asked. Darnell finally spoke. "Because I made the wrong people angry." That was an understatement. Before his arrest, Darnell had been investigating a corrupt government contractor smuggling weapons to domestic terrorist groups. When he got too close to the truth, they framed him and buried him in a prison filled with enemies. They thought he'd be dead within a week. They didn't know they had just locked a wolf inside the henhouse. Retaliation that night, Braddock made his move. Darnell was in the yard, minding his business, when the Iron Skulls swarmed him. 10 men, all armed, all ready to kill. The guards turned a blind eye. This was a sanctioned hit. Braddock sneered. "You should have stayed down, boy." Darnell cracked his knuckles. "You should have brought more men." Then the storm came. The first man charged, swinging a makeshift blade. Darnell caught his wrist, broke his elbow with a sharp twist, and used the same knife to gut another attacker. He weaved through them like a ghost, a blur of fists, elbows, and devastating strikes. One man went down screaming as Darnell shattered his knee. Another crumpled after a precise chop to the throat. Braddock watched in horror as his men fell one by one. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Finally, it was just him and Darnell. Braddock pulled a hidden blade. "I'll kill you, you black crack." Darnell's fist silenced him, breaking his jaw and dropping him like a sack of bricks. He knelt over Braddock, eyes cold. "You lost before you even started." Justice comes knocking. The next morning, U.S. Marshals arrived at the prison. A senator's office had received an anonymous dossier detailing the conspiracy that put Darnell away. The evidence was airtight. The men responsible had already been arrested. Warden Harris personally escorted Darnell to the gates. "You ever need a favor, Carter, you call me," he said, shaking his hand. Darnell nodded. "Appreciate it." As he stepped outside, the sun hit his face for the first time in months. A black SUV pulled up. The window rolled down, revealing an old friend, Colonel Briggs, his former commanding officer. "About time we got you out, Ghost," Briggs said. "You ready to get back to work?" Darnell cracked a rare smile. "Let's roll." The Ghost had returned, and his enemies were about to learn why they should have never tried to bury him alive. Back to the fight. Darnell, Ghost, Carter stepped out of the prison gates and into the black SUV without a word. Colonel Briggs, his old Delta Force commander, watched him closely. "You good?" Briggs asked as he drove. Darnell stared out the window. He had spent 6 months in hell, framed by powerful men who wanted him dead. The rage inside him hadn't cooled. It had only sharpened. "I'll be good when we burn them down," Darnell said. Briggs nodded. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." As the SUV sped down the highway, Darnell knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The people who had put him in prison weren't just criminals. They were powerful men with deep connections, and they weren't going to let him walk away. If they wanted a war, he'd give them one. The Shadow War begins. The first target was Raymond Holloway, CEO of a private military contractor called Vanguard Defense Solutions. He was the man who had orchestrated Darnell's downfall, framing him to cover up a massive illegal arms trade. Briggs pulled into a safe house in Virginia, where a small team of operatives waited. They were all ex-special forces, all handpicked. A woman with sharp blue eyes and a sniper's build stepped forward. "Sierra Cross," she introduced herself. "Former SEAL. I've been tracking Vanguard's ops for months. They're running weapons to domestic terror cells." Darnell nodded. "Then we burned them down." The first strike. Vanguard operated out of a high-security facility in Maryland, disguised as a logistics company. Darnell and Sierra infiltrated the compound under cover of darkness, disabling cameras and guards with silent efficiency. Inside, they found Holloway's secret files, proof of corruption, blackmail, and names of high-level officials involved. But before they could extract the data, an alarm blared. They had been made. The assault-armed mercenaries poured into the room, rifles raised. Sierra dove for cover as Darnell flipped a desk and returned fire with pinpoint accuracy. His military instincts kicked in. Move, shoot, cover. Within seconds, 3 men lay dead. But more were coming. Briggs' voice crackled over the comms. "Get out now. You've got a strike team inbound." Darnell grabbed a flash drive with the evidence and signaled Sierra. "Time to go." They fought their way through the facility, taking out guards with brutal efficiency. Sierra sniped enemies from cover while Darnell moved like a ghost, eliminating targets in close-quarters combat. Outside, a black helicopter roared to life, Vanguard's reinforcements. Darnell sprinted toward an armored truck, hot-wiring it in seconds. "Get in." Sierra jumped in, and they tore through the gates just as bullets rained down from above. The reckoning back at the safe house, Briggs analyzed the flash drive. "This is enough to bury Holloway and half of Washington." Darnell wasn't satisfied. "Not enough. I want him." Holloway knew he was exposed. He was on the run, hiding in a private estate in Colorado, guarded by an army of mercenaries. But it wouldn't be enough. Darnell had been hunted. Now it was his turn. Final showdown. Darnell, Sierra, and a small strike team stormed Holloway's estate under the cover of night. Suppressed gunfire took out guards, and within minutes, Darnell was inside. He found Holloway in a panic room, shaking. You should have killed me in prison, Darnell said coldly. Holloway reached for a gun, too slow. Darnell's fist shattered his jaw. By morning, Holloway was in federal custody, and the conspiracy was exposed. Darnell's name was cleared, but the war wasn't over. As he looked toward the horizon, he knew one thing. The ghost had returned, and he was just getting started. The ghost in cell block D loose ends. Darnell Carter stood on the balcony of the safe house, watching the sunrise. The war against Vanguard was over, but something inside him told him this wasn't the end. He had spent years in the shadows, fighting battles the world never knew about. Now, after being framed, locked up, and hunted, he had finally cleared his name. But there was still one last mission left. Briggs stepped beside him. You did it, Ghost. Holloway's done, and every name on that flash drive is either arrested or running scared. Darnell didn't answer right away. He had spent months fighting back, but there was one thing still bothering him. Someone bigger gave Holloway the green light, Darnell muttered. He wasn't smart enough to pull this off alone. Briggs sighed. We traced the orders back to one name, Senator Malcolm Torrance. He's the real mastermind. Darnell clenched his jaw. Where is he? Briggs smirked. Underground, protected by federal security. But we both know that won't stop you. Breaking the unbreakable Torrance was holed up in a fortified compound in Washington, D.C., guarded by black ops soldiers loyal to Vanguard. No way in, no way out. Unless you were the ghost. Darnell infiltrated the compound under the cover of a storm, moving like a shadow. He evaded patrols, disabled cameras, and made his way to the senator's private quarters. Inside, Torrance sat at his desk, sipping whiskey, unaware of the storm that had entered his home. Darnell stepped into the light. Game's over. Torrance froze, his eyes widening. You're supposed to be in prison. Darnell smirked. That was your first mistake? The senator lunged for a gun, but Darnell was faster. He disarmed him in a blink, slamming him against the desk. Why? Darnell growled. Torrance gasped, struggling against Darnell's grip. You were a threat. You knew too much. Darnell tightened his hold. You framed me, had me locked up, put a price on my head. And now, I'm taking you down. Torrance smirked, despite the pain. You think taking me out will change anything? There will always be men like me. Darnell leaned in. Then I'll always be there to hunt them. He knocked Torrance out cold and left him tied up with a flash drive containing every crime he had ever committed. By morning, the FBI stormed the compound. The senator was finished. A ghost walks away a week later. Darnell stood at Arlington Cemetery, staring at the graves of fallen brothers. Sierra approached. So what now? Darnell exhaled. I'm done. Briggs, standing nearby, smirked. You really believe that? Darnell turned to them both. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He had one. He was free. But the world was still broken, and men like him were still needed. I guess we'll see, he said with a small grin. As he walked away, disappearing into the city streets, one thing was certain. The ghost would always return when he was needed.